Hi.
Hello, Gautam.
Hi. Can you
Mm,
hear me?
Yes, hello everyone. Uh, the topic for today's discussion is pretty interesting. I don't want to take any further time. Gautam, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. Hope everyone's doing fine. Um,
Sorry to intervene. You can set the rules of how you want the discussion to happen.
yeah, I think you can do it like we did last time. I think it worked well. I just want to outline or kind of do a little bit of a framing of the some of the issues, and then we can get into discussion. I think that format worked well last time, and we can
All
stick
right.
to that. Yeah. Um, I mean, so the symposium that I sent around happened last year, and the lead writer Amy Kapczynski is an intellectual property rights scholar um, in the US. But beyond that, she is also a co-founder of a very interesting scholarly movement in the US called Law and Political Economy. They have a blog called the Law and Political Economy blog, which I would recommend very strongly to all of you. And if you want to have a sense of what it's about, um, they have a manifesto. One of the earliest posts on the blog was a manifesto that sets out what exactly law and political economy is, and I think it'll give you a good sense of I think a certain range of issues that are there in this symposium, and I think are also very relevant to thinking through many of the things that are happening um, in um, in India right now. The genesis of the term political economy is itself a very interesting one, and it is that through the late 18th and 19th century, there was a discipline of study called the political economy, whose primary exponents were Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx. Of course, they came at these issues from very different angles, but they were all interested in studying how the decisions pertaining to the production and distribution and consumption of goods in a society were made, and how the balance of power between different classes affected those decisions. And so that's why we have the term political economy, this merger of the economy with the political domain. In the early 20th century, there was a very conscious effort to keep these political questions beyond the scope of legitimate study. And so political economy became economics, and economics was treated as a science that you can study through demand and supply curves. And the questions that you were going to focus on were no longer these broad questions about class conflict, about distribution, production, and so on, but were much narrower and more micro level questions, about demand, supply, consumption, and so on. And so this effort to remove the political from the economic was a great success, which is why those of you who would have studied these subjects in school and in college would have studied economics and not political economy. And you can already, I think, see the relevance that this has to the essays that you have read in the symposium. um, so this law and political economy movement is an effort to revive the study of political economy and to understand how these decisions are taken, and the link between democracy and the management of the economy. So it's very interesting, and I'd really strongly recommend subscribing to the blog and following what they're doing. In fact, the latest round of posts on the blog, I think, will be of specific interest to all of you, because they deal with the many of the dilemmas and choices that arise with doing lawyering on behalf of indigent people in a society like ours, and what are the ethical issues, and what changes can you hope to achieve through that um, way of litigation. So just take a look whenever you're free. So I think that I want to start with that, because that would be a little bit of a framing um, device for these essays. Now, I want to set out 3 points I think run across the essays, and maybe will help to frame the discussion. The first point is about the history of human rights and what the human rights discourse um, is about, and the problems that exist with this discourse and the critiques of it, which I think is central to the symposium. The second is the distinction between dominium and imperium that comes across in Queen Slobodian's response piece, which I think is also extremely important. And the third is this tension between the national and the international. And given today's globalized economy, what are the limits of what you can achieve through litigation and movements in national courts, and what you can't achieve in those forums. So there are three kind of framing points I will briefly talk about. So the first is the history of human rights, and its political significance. This whole idea of Bill of Rights, constitutional rights, fundamental rights, in its contemporary form arises out of the American Revolution, a little later the French Revolution. And if you look at the histories of those revolutions, you'll find that those revolutions towards the end were driven by an ascendant middle class, that, for want of a better word, that wanted a certain kind of protection against absolute state power. What until that time was monarchic feudal power. It wanted protection from that state power, and also wanted freedom for itself to engage in what would soon become global industrial capitalism. And so, therefore, the rights, the way rights were framed, and the way that these bills of rights were conceptualized, they effectively were conceptualized as a barrier to what the centralized state could do. And the idea, the philosophy was that to the extent that you can stop the state from acting, what is left is the domain of freedom, where individuals and groups can act as they see fit without any kind of state uh, action constraining them. So the state was seen as the locus of unfreedom, a threat to freedom, and stopping the state and constraining the state was the route towards achieving freedom. And as many people have pointed out, this left a whole host of questions untouched, questions that pertain to the organization of society beyond the domain of the state. So the economic question, the relationship between socioeconomic classes and so on, the relationship within the household between men and women, patriarchy, all of that was completely left untouched, very consciously so, because the objective of this middle class, this bourgeois class, was to preserve its own power and stop the state from interfering with it. And that's why these bills of rights really focused on what we now know as civil and political rights, and did not go beyond that. Now, the shortcomings of that model and that way of conceptualizing rights became evident over the years in many revolutions in the 19th century. Fascinating topic, but not for this discussion. And gradually, the understanding dawned that this was not enough in society. And so, post World War II, 1950s, and following that, you get a more broader, more expansive vision of what rights are about. And so now you don't just have civil and political rights, you also have what we understand as socio-economic rights, right to food, right to basic goods such as healthcare, and which is the focus of this symposium, and the right to a clean environment, and so on. And of course, as Indian lawyers, this is something we're very familiar with. This explosion of socioeconomic rights being read into Article 21 after the PIL era is something we are very familiar with. That is the road that we have taken as well. So in effect, or to put it in one sentence, the idea that questions about access to the basic goods you require for a dignified life, such as food, shelter, healthcare, and so on, can be articulated in the language of rights, and claims can be made against the state in the language of rights, and the state can be asked to enforce those claims in a judicial forum. That is basically what the underlying idea is. Now, there are two critiques of this approach, and in call one the soft critique and one the hard critique. The soft critique is that all of this has very limited utility, because ultimately the competence and the powers of courts are limited. They can pass orders on these issues. Ultimately, compliance will lie in the hands of the administration, the executive, which is often recalcitrant, has its own logic. And so you might have a few gains and benefits, but ultimately this is a futile endeavor, because you can't enforce these kinds of rights in court. You have to fight for them politically. There's a soft critique which says that courts are not the right forums because of limitations in what they can do. The harder critique, and this is a critique made in a series of books which I would recommend because they are extremely interesting. One is a book called The Morals of the Market by Jessica White. And the other is by Quinn Slobodian, who's one of the essayists in this symposium, called The Globalists. And we'll get to that. We'll come back to that in a moment. And so these people make and a guy called Samuel Moyen, whom you might have heard of. These people make a harder critique, and what they say is that what the language of rights has done is that, so when you think of a right, you think of an individual rights bearer, or a group of individuals that possess that right. So I have a right, and those of you who have read Hofeld know that there is a standard correlation. A right means a duty. So I have a right. This has to mean that there is an identifiable entity which has a duty towards me. So my right means their duty, and we are bound in this correlative equation, where the fact that I have a right means someone else has a duty towards me. It could be the state, it could be a private party. That's a different debate altogether. And so the critique is that framing these issues in this language of a correlation between two parties completely hides what is really happening here, which is a much more basic and fundamental question of political economy and choices in how you organize the economic structure of a society. And that is where this symposium is located. So as Amy Kapczynski points out in her piece, and as some of the others point out, you go to court, right, and you say, look, there is this medicine that I'm not able to afford, I can't access it. This violates my right to healthcare because I can't get the medicine. So the court needs to fashion a judicial remedy to ensure I get that medicine. And let us say that the court agrees and orders that you be given that medicine. Now, the thrust of Amy Kapczynski's critique and all this critique is that this is completely hiding the entire reason why medicines are priced beyond the reach of so many people. And that reason is the entire structure of patent law that is not only devised within the nation state, as in the parliament's legislation, but is webbed into a whole set of international treaties dealing with the issue of the production and access to medicine. And so even if a court orders that this medicine be given, ultimately the government will have to pay for that medicine. And the reason why the government will have to pay crazy amounts, which will then hamstring its efforts to maybe bring in like cheaper medicines elsewhere, is because the prices are set through this entire economic and legal regime. This patent regime that effectively legally codes a state-sanctioned monopoly, right? That's what IPR is, right? IPR is effectively a state-sanctioned legal monopoly that is given to a set of individuals, right? And so you're basically missing where the source the oppression or of the unfreedom is. And the language of rights then becomes this kind of very convenient uh, way of depoliticizing what is happening. And just like economics takes out the political out of political economy, the entire rights discourse takes out what is effectively a set of political choices made by many actors over time, and therefore focuses instead on what the court is doing and what the court is asking the state to do. Right? So that is basically this like deeper critique of human rights in general, as effectively leaving the structures that are responsible for something like high medicine prices untouched, while apparently claiming to provide access in the immediate or short term. Right? And of course, now the point of Kapczynski's piece is that she goes a little further and says, okay, you still can have possibilities, right? So even within this critique and this framework, the rights discourse has potential, it has possibilities. But the really key point that she makes is that that we need to fundamentally rethink what we are doing when we are discussing things in the language of rights, and we need to study political economy and link the two to ensure that the way we approach the issue is one that is aware of the fact that ultimately the questions are one of political economy, and the rights discourse has to be refashioned to reflect that reality. Right? That's the core contribution that she makes in the essay, and what comes out of the discussion between the various writers and participants of the symposium. That's one of the first and the big point I wanted to make. This last bit is also a helpful segue into the distinction that Slobodian makes between dominium and imperium. Uh, I'll try and break it down a little bit more, because that article is quite brief, and he doesn't really explain in great detail. The explanation actually comes from his book, The Globalist, which I would really recommend. It's a fantastic history of economic ideas post 1950s. And it's written like a thriller. It's written like a novel. So it's a really good read. And so what Slobodian actually uncovers and discusses is that, so I mean, in common discourse, you associate right-wing economic ideas with this whole idea of laissez-faire, right? Like there's like a free market unencumbered by regulations, and in that free market, all goods and services will find their appropriate price, demand and supply curves, and give the ideal arrangement. But for that, you need to leave the market alone. It has to be free. It has to be untouched by regulation. Now, that was a 19th century idea. The intellectual successors of those thinkers in the 20th century, specifically after the Great Depression, after the World War, and a number of progressive economic measures taken by various governments, were keenly aware that paradoxically, in order for the market to be free in this sense, you need to have a strong state. So it's not that the state has to leave the market alone and not interfere. The state has to interfere in order to structure and shape the market in a particular way, one that is as receptive and facilitative of competition as is possible to be. Right? That is what we call neoliberalism, as distinguished from classical liberalism. And so these scholars also understood that the more you do that, the more pushback there will be from democratic politics, because people will find that the qualities of life is being worsened, inequality is rising, and so on, like it did in the 19th century. And so there will be a strong pushback on the democratic front against this, and to reverse and roll back neoliberal policies. So what they propose, these thinkers, Friedrich Hayek and so on, is what Slobodian calls encasement. So what they said was that we will encase the economy from democratic interference, democratic politics. And so we will basically make it impossible to change the core economic arrangements, even by using democratic means. So the economy is beyond the reach of democracy. That could happen in multiple ways. One way in which that happens is to actually enshrine these ideas in a constitution. So Pinochet's constitution in Chile, after he overthrew in a military coup Salvador Allende and became a dictator. So the first attempt to instantiate that was literally in the Chilean constitution, where you could not, through democratic arrangements, make changes to the way the economy was structured and nationalize or bring into public ownership various things. The other way in which they propose this would happen would be through a network of international treaties that would bind sovereign nation states, and breach of which would be adjudicated not by a national court applying the national constitution, but by an international tribunal that would be sitting somewhere completely different in a different country. And they would adjudicate the point of whether this sovereign state had breached a treaty provision or not, and had therefore infringed the rights of an investor or not. That is the birth of investor state arbitration and international treaty arbitration that I think is presently touted in law schools as being like the ultimate goal that everyone should aim for, like becoming part of like international arbitration. The real story is a much darker one than what is often taught, especially in these courses. But that actually, so the idea basically being that the people acting through democratically, elected representatives acting through democratic procedures must not be allowed to change the economic structure that exists. And in the IP context, the best example of this is something like TRIPS. TRIPS is the international treaty that effectively sets out a threshold intellectual property international standard that all the states have to adhere to, and breach of that results in various consequences. And that brings me to the last point, which is the shortest point, which is that one thing that this conversation and this symposium makes clear is that because of globalization and because of the manner in which this encasement of the economic from the political has happened in the international, supranational domain, the ability of both sovereign nation states as well as the ability of litigation in national courts, constitutional litigation to secure rights in the language of rights, is a limited limited path, because the locus of power is no longer only your state, your country. The locus of power also lies at the international level, and therefore that kind of fundamental change cannot just come through litigation in national courts. And as Kapczynski shows, as the discussion shows, there will be often unintended consequences that will flow even from what would seem to be good judicial orders. The reason for those consequences would be that the real power is coming from elsewhere. So it's not just the Supreme Court interpreting the Indian Constitution. It's also what that means for the global political economy that's not concerned with the Indian Constitution or the Indian Supreme Court, but has a logic of its own that is based on these ideas of maintaining a certain economic structure that cannot be challenged through national courts or national parliaments or assemblies. Right? So that's something worth thinking about. And so I think to sum up, and of course there are many other issues that are discussed in these essays. This is generally, I think, two things. One is to be a lot more circumspect, a lot more cautious when we deploy or employ the language of rights and the rights discourse, and the importance of being aware that the problems and the oppressions that we are engaging with cannot be solved with the language of rights. There's something more that is required there. And the second is to be aware of how closely the national and the international domains are linked, and to again be aware of how that plays out even in our daily lives when we're trying to kind of use the language of rights to improve people's lives and to get access to important resources. And so I think that the goal of this symposium is to kind of open our eyes to these issues, and to encourage us to think much more critically, and go beyond the kind of easy understanding of what rights can do and achieve and bring to us. So I think that I've spoken long enough. It's like yeah, it's all 25 minutes. So I think that this is a good point to I think enter into the discussion and the conversation.
Shivansh, you can unmute your.
Hello, hello, hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah. So in Amy's speech, she said that manufacturing costs are nothing compared to what patent holders charge for their medicines. But what about the research and development costs? I mean, I agree with the lower prices should exist perspective, but how will Indian pharmaceuticals sustain then?
Yeah, this is a good point, and there are like multiple um, answers to that. But can I just clarify? You first said a research and development cost, so like that's one, that's one issue. The second, you said how will Indian pharmaceuticals sustain low prices? Are you linking the two, or are the two separate issues, two separate questions?
Two separate questions.
Yeah, because on the second, the issue is the thing is right. The reason why Indian pharmaceuticals have been able to maintain low costs all these years, and the reason why India is kind of the pharmacy of the developing world, is actually because Indian pharmaceuticals have been able to make use of the various flexibilities that are there in the international IP regime, and have been able to effectively reverse engineer through generics many of those like highly priced drugs. So if you see this film called Fire in the Blood, which is actually about the AIDS crisis in Africa, you will see how Cipla basically was able to make an AIDS HIV cocktail drug that was a generic drug that was able to bring down the prices by some crazy amounts and literally saved the lives of millions of people because of that. And the debate there, and those of you who have studied IP would have read the Novartis case, is of course the extent to which the international legal regime allows for that to happen. On your R&D, so now this is an interesting point, and there are two or three different nuances here. So one is that one fact that's often kept very, very well hidden by pharmaceutical companies is that massive amounts, a massive percentage of R&D costs is publicly funded by the state, because these companies often do not actually want to take the risk of the initial R&D that has no prospect of success. And so I'll send around a piece after this, but it has basically done a percentage of the breakdown of how much contribution to R&D happens by the state and how much by the private sector, and it's massively skewed in favor of the public, the state and the public sector. It's some like I think the advanced R&D some 35%, and basic like 70%, some figure of that kind. I'll send you the exact details. The second is a deeper point, which is that the question is still within the paradigms of the existing IP regime as being the only possible legal regime that is feasible. So when you ask the question of who will fund R&D costs, the assumption is still there, is that that when the law rewards and for a moment now forget private, public. What the first point, that the law rewards the risk taking that is there through putting in money into R&D, by then awarding a monopoly to whoever has taken that risk and put in that money. That's basically the underlying philosophical assumption that justifies the IP regime. And again, as scholarship has shown, and I'll circulate some stuff on this as well, this particular way of using the law to do this is not the only way that is potentially available. And so in another piece called The Cost of Price, Amy Kapczynski explores alternatives to this model, what she calls a price-based model, and that where the government like basically stipulates certain amount of prize money for like those who can like come find a solution to a certain like medical problem and things like that, and how they have actually historically worked these models, and how they were actually at one point serious alternatives to IP. So IP basically is it's worthwhile remembering that that sometimes we take like the legal structure that is there in front of us, and it becomes easy to kind of think that this is always and been the only way to regulate this particular like domain. Often that's not the case, and something like IP is specific, a very very historically contingent legal regime. And I think one of the challenges that we have, I think, in today's day and age, is to actively think how to get beyond these legal regimes that are clearly not working for a large majority of people. So I think this is not so much an answer, but more like I think a series of like starting points for like further thought. And I'll send around some of the stuff that I mentioned in the course of what I just said. Yeah.
Adela?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
So in Amy's article, she talks about how in several of the cases that see court, the judges often prescribe expensive patented versions of a drug, even though off-brand generic high-quality versions are available, often indigenously. But she doesn't shed light on why that is the case. So why do you think that is, when logically it would be cheaper on the budget of the government for them to prescribe the cheaper version of it?
Yeah, no, I mean, so I think that is again a question of how specific litigation has played out in different countries, and often there is a lot of manipulation that happens, behind the scenes in these kinds of cases, where courts often ask, say, the government to suggest, which generic or like which drug they want to like use to solve the issue, and then there'll often be negotiations between the government and like powerful private players. So I mean, and the regulatory agencies and so on. So I think what you're referring to there is that when courts are deciding these cases, they are always doing so on the basis of limited information, and ultimately they end up turning to the very bodies that are responsible for the problem to solve it, and that leads to certain further perverse incentives and opportunities for like certain kinds of other corruption. So I think that's what she's referring to. That's my reading of it.
Shivansh?
Hello. So yeah, I was wondering whether the idea of human rights obligations of multinational corporations, which is not a thing yet, but also although there are a lot of people who are advocating it, and could that help address the issue of could that help address the political economy issues through the language of rights? I mean, the problem under the current paradigm is that we have the right to affordable medicines against state who have to still have to pay full prices to pharma companies. If those rights could be levied against the pharma companies themselves, would that allow us to challenge the lack of accessibility because of the high prices or monopolies using the language of human rights?
Yeah, so see, I mean, this is a very good question, and I think the problem so yeah, to partially yes, to an extent, like there is potential there. But see, again, the problem is that it's not so. Okay, so if you had a situation where like one private corporation, right, exercised a monopoly over, the pharmaceutical industry, then yes, like this kind of like litigation maybe in certain circumstances might work in certain ways. The problem is actually not that you have like one company, that is exercising like a state-like monopoly over a public good. The problem is attributable to the structure of patent law, which allows for um, uh, which allows this kind of an economic arrangement to exist, right? So again, like the problem with the rights discourse is not just who it's directed against, uh, which is a state or a private party. The problem is the rights discourse imagines that you have like two part two well two or like an identifiable set of parties, and if you manage to like recalibrate the relationship among them, then you will solve the problem. But the problem is actually much deeper, right? It lies in the legal regime that you have set up in the first place. So like it's not about forcing one company or like two companies to lower prices, but it's actually about, as I said, the political economy, right? Which is like which goes beyond any one person. Now there's like an interesting parallel, or to simplify it like much more, and to take a much more like basic, like a very basic kind of like an image. So Marx, in some of his early kind of works, and not sorry, Marx, some of the early works that were written by Marx, um, he actually talks about how, like in the capitalist economy, the kind of the profit motive and the incentive to like make profits effectively ensures that the capitalist is as constrained in what they can do as is the worker. Of course, the level of suffering is much greater, but if the capitalist does not like cut costs and like cut wages and increase production, all of that, right, that individual capitalist will be forced out by other more efficient capitalists, right? And so ultimately, like this becomes this thing where because of the way you have arranged the political economy, where the profit motive is what is driving production, distribution, and consumption, you have ensured that no one actor really has the ability or the freedom to change that. Similarly, and so I said, like, this is a very basic, much more reductive example, but try and like kind of elevate that to the level of like kind of the market of pharmaceuticals, right? So it's not that one corporation will even be in a position to change that, even if you force them to lower their prices. So the solution is more like imagining an alternative to kind of this system where which is like entirely based on motivations of profit driving the decisions of which drugs are like produced, how much, in what quantities, for which illnesses, and so on. So I think that's kind of the deeper issue at stake over here.
Okay.
Also, like,
Uh,
I
but
don't want this to be like a monologue. So, like, or like, just like
yeah.
others have comments like on this. Like, please kind of like jump in and should it be like a Q&A? It can like be like a conversation. Yeah.
So yeah, what do you think as a constitutional expert and a lawyer? Do you think, keeping in mind the socio-political issues of India, do you think this is a practical idea and this could be enforced by the courts of law in India?
I want to add, especially in the light of courts refusing to cap medical expenses even during COVID. Just to add to what Shivansh has said, that was my question.
Yeah, no, I mean, so I think okay, I'm not an IP expert, like, so I mean, my impression has been that by and large, the Indian government over the years, successive governments, has been pretty good in being able to work through the flexibilities in the international treaties like TRIPS and so on, to do what they can in those spaces and allow for generics and things to happen. I mean, that was the basis of the whole Novartis case in the first place. Section 3D of the Indian Patent Act that effectively prohibits evergreening, as a technique of infinitely extending the lifespan of patents for like long periods. So I think that, like, given the socio-political context right now, I think like kind of a continued focus on how best India can continue to use these flexibilities is I think the most feasible way I see going forward, until the time, of course, in which like there can be a proper internationalist movement to kind of alter
Mm.
those global rules. Where that's probably like a far away in the future right now. But it's, again, I think the importance is to like try and start working towards that as early as possible, because it'll take, of course, a very long time to get anywhere with that. Although it may not either. But interestingly, I mean, those of you who follow international arbitration would be aware that actually in 2016 India developed a new model BIT that was in response to the fact that India kept on getting sued by international investors in like international forums for like massive amounts of money because of breaches of BITs, alleged breaches of BITs. And so now the Indian model BIT is much more restrictive in what kinds of issues can go to international arbitration. And there's like a kind of worldwide backlash against this whole BIT kind of proliferation. So yeah, I mean, like I think like it's worthwhile being aware of the limitations of like the ability to change that structure right now, and therefore focusing on what we can do, like flexibilities in the international regime, but also thinking of how we can, as a collective, as people, move towards that overall goal as well.
There is a query from YouTube. Someone, Swarang Verma, has asked, what do you think of parallels between exploitation as understood in international law discourse and exploitation from a Marxist perspective, law validating the PE that validates the theft of surplus value?
So I don't actually know how exploitation is understood in international law. So so maybe if like Swarang can kind of elaborate on that, because I don't actually know what the definition is under international law.
So Sarthak from our team has asked, there is a problem with his mic, that when we move to a path where the courts are to ensure access to healthcare, medicines, then won't the court become a quasi-cabinet executive and take up certain ambitious projects such as eradicating malnourishment? What would stop the court from determining policy like being a free market state or a socialist state if such interventions are allowed?
I mean, so like, yeah, I mean, so one point I think that in any case comes across in the symposium is that kind of piecemeal interventions using the language of rights, right, is counterproductive and often damaging, and you cannot actually accomplish that without a much more deeper engagement with the political economy, and the courts are not the best people to do that. So to that extent, that point is well taken. But I think that the interesting bit about Amy's piece is she doesn't stop there. She gives some examples of how courts have actually acted in Latin American countries, which in a way that engages with these broader questions while remaining within the broadly judicial role, right? So I think that there is always a path that a court can take that does not involve it getting into these policy-based questions. I think a good example is actually this whole, since Anas mentioned it, this whole price caps, right? Now, okay, like court can't decide price caps, fine, like take that as a fair point. But the court can ask questions, right? So if the argument is that a price cap will lead to a reduction in the production of whatever it is that's being discussed at tests, COVID tests in that case, the court can ask, okay, show us the calculations, show us like the costs that you incur in these testing kits, and then it can examine that. So I mean, so if like your costs are like 10 rupees and your test is 100 rupees, obviously there is something wrong there, right? I mean, and often you'll find that, and this is something I have found over the last couple of years. Um, the moment the court actually asks these questions, you find that these parties, no party in particular, but like, well, at least in my experience, often the state, uh, has no argument at all. So like they have basically come and made some assertions in the belief that the court will not challenge them on it and not ask any questions. The moment the first question is asked, like, show us how, show us the logical link between your assertion and your conclusion, they have no answer because there is no link. And so often at that level itself, that kind of argument breaks down. But yeah, beyond that, of course, I mean, as I said, like, I think the point of the symposium is that you can't solve these problems without engaging with political economy, and so therefore there the role of courts is kind of like constrained at best. So yeah, that point is, I think, true.
Okay. Aribuddin asks, he cites Justice Iyer in totalitarian treaty power and constitutional control jurisprudence, and he asks whether international obligation treaties are promoting globalization or are a threat to sovereignty.
Yeah, there's a very famous economist called Dani Rodrik, who has this thing called the trilemma, where he says that national sovereignty, democracy, and globalization, you can have two of the three at any time. You can't have all three. And I think that kind of sums up the problem. So yeah, I mean, the argument is that when you enter into a treaty, you are effectively contracting, right? So you are as the nation state, as the sovereign state, you are voluntarily putting constraints on your own future actions by entering into a contract with another country or other country. So in that sense, I mean, formally, what the other side will say is that, look, there is no sovereignty abdication here because you are choosing to contract into these obligations. But of course, as we know, I mean, ultimately, these are all, in the international sphere, are all functions of unequal power relations. So you often have no feasible choice but to enter into these treaties, because the consequence is that powerful players like the US will then dictate terms in ways that are unfavorable to you. And for example, I mean, the US every year has this list of countries who are like, IP defaulters or like IP bad people. And every time India would like push back on some generic drug issue, India would be placed on that like list of like IP bad guys, right? So you have all these ways in which powerful countries bully less powerful countries into entering these so-called like free and voluntary treaties. So I think that that's definitely a big issue.
And there is one more from Rikit. Sir, what influenced or prompted the WTO to make regulations granting stronger IP rights, particularly for medicines?
I mean, the influence there is this is a subject more of a international trade historian than someone like me. But a lot of it is, you'll find the answer in Slobodian's book. He talks about like the gradual development of neoliberal logic over the 50s and 60s and 70s, and how that essentially captured like kind of the rungs of decision-making power in all these organizations, like GATT originally and the IMF and things like that. So it was more of like a institutional capture over many years that led to kind of this becoming the governing logic of international economic law as such.
Okay, there's another one. I'm reading the questions. So it's one Syed Ahmed asked on YouTube, your thoughts on the impact of insurance-based / dominant healthcare system like in US, and how can implementation of the same in a country like India lead to denial of right to medicine, considering the factors such as extremely low insurance redemption ratio in India and the prolonged litigation that takes place?
I mean, like, see, I'm not, again, like, I think this is like really a core health policy question, and I don't know to what extent I'm even remotely competent to answer, on different healthcare models. I think my answer is what I think everyone can see, which is that the American system is just not working. Not only is your insurance linked to your employment, which I think you've seen over the last 3 or 4 months, that a lot of people have been kicked off their employment because of COVID and have lost access to like their healthcare as a result, which is like obviously a huge issue. Not only that, but it turns out that the US actually pays way more for its healthcare than every other developed country that has socialized healthcare, as non-insurance based socialized public healthcare. The costs are actually much lower than American costs. So I am not like a general votary of an insurance based system. I think that the evidence across the world shows that that a public a publicly run healthcare system is ultimately a better way to go. But as I said, like this is I think really a core health policy question, and you need like health policy experts to answer that in more detail than I can. I'm just going by my observations from what I've seen.
He was anyway asking for your view on that.
Yeah, it's a non-expert layperson's view. So just to make that clear.
Yeah. All right. Anything else? Anyone has to add any point? Ask anything?
Sir, I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Sir?
Yes.
Okay, so like you have been discussing all this while about the like how all the like policies regarding this medicines and everything, it is linked to how the capitalist system is rampant in the world economy, to be honest. So if we go by the present scenario, the conservative right, as we say it, is very much prevalent in the overall global economy. So how, like, what is the way forward for people to actually get like medicine or these things, the right to medicine in a more accessible way? Because as we are seeing it, the conservative right is as powerful as ever. I mean, they are looming large in every place. So what is a way forward as you see it?
I mean, you basically asked me how do we change the world. And I think that like
No, sir, like because if like we go by all the discussions, if we see it, so like there are always loopholes about like IPR and all the policies. But so there has to be some way, I guess, because the main problem is a conservative right, which is what they make the policies, they do everything. But I think there has to be some way. So
no, I mean,
that
see, as I said, like there are short term ways, and then there are long term things, right? Short term, as I've said before, like the international legal regime has multiple flexibilities that were put at the behest of countries like India, specifically for these purposes. You know, and they can be used. They are being used. The present government also has at various times kind of tried to use those flexibilities to like check the kind of impulse of unbridled profit seeking in the healthcare sector. So I think that there are some like technical short term solutions. See, I think long term, what you said, the conservative right wing's influence in at the international and national levels. I mean, there's nothing. I mean, there's no like solution that can be laid out with any clarity, except that. And I know I've recommended this book multiple times today, but The Globalists is an excellent, also an excellent story about how neoliberal logic, which is kind of this whole and using a strong state to kind of encase the market from democratic oversight, how they became dominant in the way that they are now. And it's this long story about what began as a bunch of like academics sitting and talking. What they were called was the Mont Pelerin Society, and how like bit by bit they gained influence in various like governmental um, uh, you know uh, 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 committees and built like academic departments and stuff like that. And the lesson you get from that is that the only way is to basically have like long-term organization, which is that people of a like mind have to kind of come together and be clear about what the problem is and what the goals are, right? And then spend like many decades, uh, often in the wilderness, uh, intellectually, politically in the wilderness, but kind of organize over time, um, in a way that their ideas become like a coherent political program that is then backed up by like popular support. And I know that's like very abstract, but that's the only successful way that ever exists, and that of course requires, I think, long-term movement building of the kind that all of you are doing here. So like that, uh, but at like a larger scale over longer time and so on. So I think like basically it would be like keep doing these kinds of like things, these kinds of movements, and build up slowly and gradually over time. That's like the best I can say about that, based on whatever I have read.
So I had a question. Given that the pharmaceutical lobby has extensively deep pockets in certain countries, especially countries not viewed as investor friendly, when they start to make regulations that tend to go against these countries' economic interests, they face immense backlash. And the issue is that certain countries don't have the alternatives India has of generic drugs, which is why these countries find themselves stuck in a kind of trap where they can't change regulatory frameworks, which is why they're stuck in the situation. So what would these countries do when they don't have any other alternatives to change their regulatory policies?
Well, so that's exactly why like the solution ultimately is at internationalist level. These countries often do not, as you said, have a choice, and so like the only feasible change is, um, by altering like this international structure of treaties that kind of bind them into this kind of global legal regime, and that can only happen, if all these countries kind of come together, um, and force a kind of change that we saw, for example, in when TRIPS was being negotiated, when the Marrakesh Treaty kind of came about, on access of visually impaired people and so on. So I think that the solution is for these kinds of issues is at the international level. It cannot be at the national level because the balance of power is too skewed there, for that to have any kind of impact.
Adib, you were saying something? Adib?
Hello.
Yeah.
So my question is relating the tribal areas of India. Relatively, when we talk about the implementation of TRIPS and any other international treaty, so don't you think that Indians are in today's world are undermining or they're neglecting the already existing remedies we have? Like the people of the tribal areas, they have the same medicine they are providing, and someone called named Josh in US would have the patent of anything which is being produced at a very simply in that level. So don't you think that it is also a kind of monopoly by the Western approach, by the Western world on the Indian market? And also only those policies, those treaties are implemented which are beneficial either to the politics of the country or to any other perspective. For example, if we talk about other treaties and other norms, they are not implemented in India very easily. And Article 253 doesn't talk about any established procedure through which there's no commission or committee made before that to lay down the basic provisions of any treaty. Like, for example, in England, they have this rule of 21 days before it goes to the crown. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, like I think that I mean both those points are quite valid, and it's also like slightly different, I think, from like this issue, which is that, yeah, so like in the sense that often these treaties and their implementation comes at the cost, um, of like indigenous ways, and of doing things, and I think that's like one issue that has to be looked at separately. Um, but also like those ways cannot solve everything, right? So you also need like, generic like drugs that are produced in using like these ways as well. So I think like it's like there are two different issues that require like separate, like focus, and like we can separately discuss like this issue as like its own thing requiring analysis. at another time. So yeah, but no, I agree with both the points.
All right. Is there anyone else? Anyone else has to add anything or? All right. So I think we had a great session today. Thank you, Gautam.
Yeah, thanks to everyone. Thanks for all the questions, conversation.
And thank you for this concept as well.
Yeah, thanks. We'll do this again sometime in the near future.
Sure thing. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, everyone.